Hunter did not have much use for birthdays, so he tended to measure years in injuries and others' guesses about his age. He knew what birthdays were, he just also knew his uncle disapproved of him slacking off, and the desire to please his only family was so great that rejecting some arbitrary day of the year seemed a reasonable price. Bruised cheekbone and a slight concussion from a punch he wasn't fast enough to dodge in training. His trainers were wary and consulted his uncle about whether to take him to the healing coven. His uncle declared them minor injuries, and Hunter was ordered to pick himself up and carry on with the training exercise, which he did without question. 3 broken fingers and a shattered tibia when he graduated from hand to hand and started training with non-magical wooden bowstaffs. The healer in the castle infirmary snapped at his trainer that no child of 4 should be put through rigmarole like that. She was told just to shut up and repair him so he could grip the staff and take a ready stance again as soon as possible. He never saw that healer again, and lost track of the date in the endless training regimen that followed. 2 broken kneecaps and a serious concussion after falling from an artificial magical staff while learning to fly over the castle courtyard. He zoned in and out during that healing, and vaguely heard some witch talking about prepubescent bones being more resilient. He did not recall bouncing much when he hit the cobblestones, but adults knew more about that sort of thing than him, so he accepted the explanation for why he wasn't dead. Detached thumb and dislocated elbow when his uncle accidentally threw him into the path of a door that was closing. That was unusual. Typically, his uncle waited for the door to be fully closed before lashing out. Then again, his uncle was clearly having a particularly awful day, so it only made sense that Hunter was in the way. The heavy wood of the door severed his thumb at the joint. If his grip on his staff had not been essential to his effectiveness in combat, his uncle assured him he would have been left to sew it back on himself as punishment. Darius of the Abomination Coven commented that even children Hunter's age could use lessons in sewing and other useful skills, but did not volunteer himself as a new tutor in Hunter's training regimen. 4 cracked ribs and slashed palms caused by a rough landing after being pushed out of an airship and told not to die. All things considered, after grabbing and hitting so many tree branches on the way down, he was surprised more hadn't broken. He supposed the injuries were so minor that no healer would be called, and he would be expected to let his body heal naturally this time. That happened a lot if things weren't serious enough, or his uncle wanted to teach him a lesson about not showing weakness in front of others. He lay on the ground beneath the tree that broke his fall for far too long, though. When he was found by something small, orange and furry that sniffed at his hair and howled to mark the discovery, he was suffering from exposure. He was dimly aware of being whisked to someone from the healing coven who murmured about him only just entering double digits, but it was hard to remember afterwards. Hypothermia and abdominal lacerations from being left on a mountain and told to find his own way down. The other Emperor's Coven recruits in their identity-smothering masks were all 12, so he assumed he must be 2. He met a snow beast halfway, with far too many teeth. By the time he reached the bottom, his own blood had frozen to his front, where the thing tried to claw his guts out. His uncle actually patted his shoulder that time, which Hunter took to mean he was proud before he passed out. Skull fractures and a thigh bone snapped in so many places, he was laid up for a week even with healing spells. He had been trying to prove his worth over the other scouts on a wild witch hunt, and been taken unawares by their target's wild magic. The blast pushed him off the edge of a cliff. He did not know how long he lay with his leg at an impossible angle, pieces of sharp rock jutting up through the muscle, each surrounded by splintered bone fragments. He faded in and out of consciousness from pain and blood loss. He thought maybe his uncle found him, but that could have been a delusion. Certainly someone encased his leg to prevent him from bleeding out, picked him up, and carried him back to the castle, muttering about little princes thinking they were immortal, and 13 being an unlucky age. Deep cuts to both arms and shoulders, while tackling a spidron that caught his uncle's caravan unawares during a visit to one of the more far-flung parts of the Isles. The poison sank deep, rendering him delusional after he stabbed it to death so hard it broke apart at the thorax. He dreamt that his uncle visited him in the infirmary, mopping his brow with a damp cloth to bring down his fever, and whispered about him not being allowed to die and waste the 14 years of hard work that had been put into him. When he woke up weeks later, he had lost so much weight his clothes did not fit right, and the castle seamstresses had to resize everything. He requested longer sleeves to cover the new scars when his uncle wasn't impressed by them. A broken clavicle from being tripped down the stairs. In the litany of injuries throughout his life, that was the one that actually embarrassed him. He was almost sure Kikimora was responsible. He was too sure-footed to have just fallen like everyone said, and she had laughed harder than anyone when he limped away to answer his uncle's summons, despite radiating pain across his shoulders. Third-degree burns that covered his hands up to the wrists from a fight with a wild witch who grabbed his arms and plunged them into her cauldron when he tried to apprehend her. He had screamed that time, something in the mixture corroding through leather gloves and flesh until bone shone through at his knuckles, white as polished narwhalathon horn. His team took her down while he was forced to watch, arms buried deep in a snowdrift, hoping the cold would stop the damage before he lost both hands and everything else he had worked so hard for. Terra Snapdragon had marched up and told him to stop crying like a newborn. He was nearly 15, not 5. She summoned a healer who performed enough triage to save his hands, but stopped them before they could completely erase the scars, claiming he needed a permanent reminder not to act like a child while on duty. Remembering his uncle's disapproval last time, Hunter started wearing his gloves every moment he was awake, even when he was alone, too ashamed to look at the evidence of his past failure. A chunk of his ear was snipped off by a juvenile Karkinos trying to protect its mother from his team when his uncle needed fresh claw meat. Hunter did not ask why. He never asked why. He used to, when he was young and stupid. Well, younger and more stupid. Now he knew better. Asking why got you worse than a permanent nick in your ear that ached when the weather got damp. Perforated gut from being run through by a unicorn his uncle dispatched him to capture so its horn could be harvested. Unicorns were carnivorous, so he took a team of trustworthy guards to coordinate the capture. However, Steve got cornered, and Hunter found himself pushing the idiot out of the charging unicorn's path before he could think better of it. Luckily, lugging around a vision-obscuring, struggling body that was stabbing at it with a knife distracted the unicorn long enough for the others to subdue it. Hunter never quite forgot the sensation of someone holding his arms back while its horn was dragged backwards through his abdomen, nor of Steve tucking a length of intestine back in like he hoped nobody would notice. Triage healing got him back to the castle, where Darius watched him be carried by on a stretcher and shook his head with one hand raised to conceal his expression, presumably disgust at Hunter's failure. His uncle was certainly disgusted at the display of incompetent compassion and promised that even 15 years of time investment was not worth a thing if Hunter could not prove he was worth the effort. Deep scores across his spine and back from throwing himself in front of Lilith Clawthorne when she wasn't aware a Shamrosh he thought was dead was very much still alive. He pretended his cloak had absorbed most of the attack and marched back to the castle at the head of the crew, dragging the beast's corpse, mocking her for her incompetence. Only when he got back to his room did he release the pained groan he had wanted to let out for hours and curse himself for his own incompetence. His uncle had warned him against ludicrous displays of compassion already. He resolved to tell no one of the injury and settled for stealing healing salves out of the infirmary when no one was looking and rubbing them awkwardly on his back alone. A slash to the face and neck when he tried to help his uncle during a particularly bad attack from his affliction. Hunter barely got the door to the throne room closed before Belos's arms melted into writhing, contorting masses of blue-green sludge. So much pained gurgling ripped from his uncle's throat that Hunter genuinely thought this was it, the big one, the moment he feared most, when the affliction would claim the life of the last of his family and leave him alone in the world. Hunter advanced, a palisman at the ready, only to be knocked back so forcefully by Belos's flailing limbs that he skidded across the floor and crashed into a table. It took him a moment to realize his throat had been gouged out, flesh ripped vertically from his pectoral up to his cheekbone, exposing all the subcutaneous fat, webwork of veins, and trembling muscles beneath. Blood surged up between his fingers as he tried to hold the wound closed and failed, vision dimming with each passing second. Death was almost a surprise with the swiftness of its arrival. Then his uncle was there, pressing a piece of paper with a drawing on it against his skin. It glowed soft blue, like a healing spell, and suddenly Hunter could breathe again. The blood stopped flowing, though his hands were stained so red he knew he had not imagined the whole thing. His uncle had apologized to him, as if there was anything to apologize for. He had gotten in the way, of course. He had failed in his duty of care. It was his own stupid fault he had gotten hurt. Yet Belos had held Hunter close regardless, an embrace so unprecedented that Hunter was too stunned to question it, and murmured about a promise he had made to never go that route again, especially since Hunter had not betrayed him yet, which confused Hunter. But then again, confusion was to be expected after so much blood loss. Darius came to visit him in the infirmary afterwards, though he did not say much. He stood inside the doorway, brows pulled down in a judgmental frown, and Hunter could not help but feel he had failed some unspoken test for him as well as Belos. Yet Darius would not explain, and left soon after, saying Hunter wore his new scars well for a kid his age. Hunter did not really understand what he meant by that. His uncle had insisted on the healer witches leaving his face scarred as a reminder, though whether for Hunter or for himself was unclear. Hunter assumed it was to remind him to not get in the way in future. A bruised coccyx when he landed after an airship crash caused by that ridiculous human who thought she could learn magic. To be fair, she might have healed him a little when he was asleep, before she slapped him awake and left a handprint over his scarred cheek. It was the kind of stupidly kind thing she would do for an enemy. Kikimura added a later head wound from an uncontrolled magical blast that would have caved in his entire skull if she had been a fraction of an inch to the left. He took grim satisfaction in slamming the little red demon's head with his staff while she was too disoriented to know he was there. Things changed after that. Flapjack, forever tucked safely into his cloak, made Hunter more aware of possible injuries. He took more care to avoid them in case the little bird got cracked or worse. He did not care for himself. His purpose was to serve the Emperor, even at the cost of his life, after all. But Flapjack had no such allegiance, and did not deserve to suffer for Hunter's incompetence or failure. That stupid human girl worked her way into his life, and no matter how much he pushed her away, she somehow kept coming back. She was like a direwolf with a bone, completely unable to be dissuaded once she had made the decision to befriend him. With her came others, trailing like thorny vines that hooked into his clothes and skin, growing back no matter how often he tried to pull them out. Captain Willow, who gave him a chance he didn't have to earn first. Gus, the prodigy illusionist, who talked big despite his diminutive stature. The youngest Blight and the cursed Owl Lady. Viney and her stupid griffin that never learned to like him. Skara, who played soothing music when he was stressed and sent him the files over Pentagram. Did he have friends? Allies? Or were they more opportunists like the Covenheads and Castle Workforce? Would any of them push him out of an airship, strand him on a mountain, or send him sprawling down a flight of stairs if he angered them? Cuts and scrapes to his face and neck from his madcap run through the woods after he and Luce escaped from his uncle's, no, Emperor Belos Philip's, mind. He tumbled down an embankment in his haste to get away from her, the owl lady, the pets they kept, and the knowledge they had uncovered. He wasn't real. He was just a copy of someone else, someone more important, whom Belos had killed regardless. When he reached the bottom, he tucked himself inside a hollow, rotten log and stayed there until dawn, too stupefied to move. Flapjack found him, but did not twitter out his location to his enemies. Allies? Friends? Instead, hopping into the log too, and bedding down in Hunter's hair, like the weight of his small body could ground him somehow. Ridiculously, it worked. Guards were looking for him in the morning, so he fled to the only place he had ever felt truly safe and accepted. When Gus discovered him hiding at the school, Hunter had not showered in weeks. His ablutions had to take place when the student bathrooms were unoccupied, and the showering facilities were locked at night when the school was closed. He knew he stank worse than griffin dung, but realistically there was nothing he could do about it. Hygiene had to take a back seat to survival while he was on the run. Why else would he have stooped to eating literal garbage? Some golden guard. Some perfect pupil. Some ideal nephew. So, when he was finally able to stop hiding, when Gus offered him a place to stay that was not a closed-off auditorium or a hollow log in the woods, Hunter cautiously accepted it, wondering all the while what the catch was. Gus's house was ordinary, in a way Hunter could not fully accept was not a trick. He made sure to bolt the bathroom door when encouraged to go inside and wash up for the first time that month. The water ran brown and grey and red, bits of soil and filth clagging the plug hole until he picked them out with a finger. He stared at his hands under the warm spray from the shower head, noting the new blisters and calluses from learning how to handle Flapjack's staff instead of the fake one given to him by his uncle, the Emperor, Belos, Philip Witterbane, an almost stranger, not his family. He turned his face up into the water, coughing when it flowed into his airway for a second. The cough jolted loose his thoughts and galvanized him back into the business of washing. He lathered up his hair with something that smelled of flowers that he could not name, washed the fresh cuts from the fight at the school so they would not get infected, and allowed a tiny bit of the tension to ease from his shoulders. That tension returned when he walked into the bedroom to find Gus depositing a pile of folded clothes on the bed. They had been for him to find once he finished in the shower. Gus had clearly intended to be gone by the time that happened, but Hunter had not allowed himself as much time for cleanliness as his new best friend? Ally had anticipated. They stared at each other with wide eyes, Gus holding a balled-up pair of blue socks, Hunter with one hand on the doorframe, one holding the towel wrapped around his waist. Gus turned away first. Hunter cinched the towel tighter and strode into the bedroom like nothing was wrong. He had long since learned that if you pretended everything was fine with enough confidence, everyone around you tended to believe it too and left you alone. Gus clearly had not learned that same lesson. He edged out of the room, muttering about his dad's shirt fitting Hunter better than his own, owing to the differences in their height, and how he was making food downstairs. Hunter let him get as far away as the hall before saying thank you and letting Flapjack nudge it closed. Only then did he sit on the bed and try to get his breathing under control, faithfully counting on his fingers until the dull ache in his ribs alleviated. He knew about his scars. They were the evidence of his failures. They did not bother him anymore, except as a reminder of those times he had screwed up. Seeing Gus's expression, though, the way his gaze ticked to the various purple marks of previous times he had been hurt for his disappointing performance, reminded Hunter why he kept them covered. However, there had been something else in Gus's gaze, something Hunter had rarely seen before and almost never aimed at himself. Sympathy. Gus felt sorry for him. But why? It did not make any sense. They were square. More than square. A sandwich, for a favour, for a rescue, for a friendship, for a place to stay, for a... Lucy's voice echoed in his head that friendship was not about that sort of give and take, which was stupid because he knew she'd never actually said that to him, so how could he be remembering her saying it? He put on the borrowed clothing, spent a few moments centering himself by stroking Flapjack's soft chest feathers, then went downstairs to where Gus was making food in the kitchen and pretending that everything was fine. Hunter was content with that. He made himself useful by helping with preparations and answering questions he had not already covered when interrogated by the school faculty about the Day of Unity. Gus's father had already gone to the head in advance. Gus was worried since he would be out of contact until after the celebration. Hunter wondered what that felt like. He had been concerned by Belos's safety when they were outside the castle, but he wasn't sure worry was the right word for it. He had felt duty-bound to protect his only family, to please him, care for him, make sure he wasn't in pain from his affliction. Was that worry? Was that love? It was all very confusing. Gus paused with an apple slice halfway to his mouth and reminded Hunter to breathe. It made Hunter's ear tips glow with furious blushing. To be reminded like that by someone who had not even graduated high school yet. He was the Golden Guard. He knew how to breathe. So why, then, did his chest feel so tight, despite the loose-fitting shirt? Why did his throat ache? Why was it so hard to talk? Gus did not ask about the scars. Hunter was not sure whether he wanted him to stay silent or not. He was even less sure when, days later, they met up with Willow to escort Luce on her mission. There were moments Gus and Willow had whispered side conversations, and more than once he saw Gus gesturing to a spot on his body where Hunter knew the worst of his old injuries showed on his own, and Willow would look over at him. Her skills of subterfuge were exactly 0. She would make an awful spy. The aching sympathy in her eyes was impossible to mistake. She was cactus sharp and diamond hard, but her eyes were always so damn soft with emotion. He was glad when Luce was dropped into the clearing in front of them, and they had something else to focus on other than him and his weaknesses. He was half convinced the draining spell would leave new scars on his arms, his chest, his neck, and his face. But the golden glow faded along with the pain when the Collector moved the moon. He moved the whole moon, sweet merciful Mother of Titans, he moved the whole moon! When they landed in the human realm, the rain did not scour his skin like those times in training when he had to run across the courtyard in a storm to build up his pain threshold. His feet hurt as they walked from the rickety wooden shack to Lucy's house. Gus carried in a piggyback because he was crying too much to stand, but it was nothing like standing on hot coals during endurance training. Hunter knew these were hurts he could manage, injuries he could withstand easier than any of the other kids. His allies. No, his friends, real friends, friends he had never asked for but now would die for if necessary. They would not judge him for his failures, he realized during that brief trip through the rain. They would feel sympathy for how much they must have hurt, but they would not judge him for how he got them. They would not think him weak, or a fool, or a failure. When Camilla Noseda asked them all to change into dry clothes that she and the basilisk who lived with her had fetched, Hunter did not hesitate. He heard the faint gasps and a soft slap as Amity covered her own mouth at the sight of his chest. Lean with muscle, but lined with so much scar tissue, it was hard to tell where one old injury ended and another began. Luce stared, because of course she did. He had known she would. And, thankfully, there was no sympathy in her eyes, just a kind of anger that wasn't directed at him, but for him. Luce knew, without him having to tell her, that his scars came from his life with Belos, who had viewed him as nothing but a tool, not a person who deserved sympathy, or friendship, or love. He made himself vulnerable in a totally new way in that moment. His body told his story better than words could. and as he settled into a huddle with his clutch of refugees, friends, damn it, who had come to mean so much to him, Flapjack nestled into his hair. Hunter contemplated that today was as good a day as any to commemorate being born again.